Welcome back. This video is going to show you how to reactivate your starter when you're ready to bake again. So let's get to it. So in this video, we're going to talk about what to do if your starter has been sitting in the refrigerator and it has been replenished and hopefully it's now at its peak activity and you're ready to take it out and it needs to be replenished and reach its peak activity again before we mix our leaven. However, if your starter has been sitting on the countertop and you have been replenishing it, you can follow along to this video as well, and the instructions will still apply. So the first thing you need to do is take your starter out and have a look at it. And as you can see here, my sorghum sourdough starter reached its peak and then fell. And I'm not worried about this. It's okay if you went past your peak and the starter fell back down. You can still feed it this way and it will just take a little bit longer in order to reach its peak again and be ready to mix your leaven. And here you can see my regular sourdough starter. And what happened here is it rose to this point and then it started to fall and then it had a second rise where it peaked a second time. This can happen with gluten-free starters as well. And it just means that your starter is very vigorous and happy and healthy. So I wanted to talk about this because this is not the peak rise. You want to feed your starter at the first peak. And this is when your wild yeast culture is at its peak activity. It's going to be producing the most carbon dioxide and going to give the best power or leavening power to your dough. So here you can see my starters from the top. This is my brown rice starter. And you can see that it has risen and fallen just a little. So I just missed the peak activity. When it's mature, this is what it will look like in the top picture. And then you can see my sorghum sourdough starter. It has also just missed its peak activity. I think a little bit further along even than my brown rice starter, but that's okay. I'm going to feed them to reactivate them right now. So I'm not going to worry that I just missed the peak activity. So let's go ahead and feed our starter. So tonight we're going to feed our starter in preparation to actually make our leaven tomorrow. So what we need to do is feed our starter in a ratio that's going to allow us to have a very low base acidity. So this is what we learned from the talk with Hendrik from the bread code. We learned about how having our starter have a lower base acidity would help improve our ability to get a rise out of our dough, so that we have a larger window in which we can ferment our dough and we don't have to be perfect. So we're going to feed our starter in a ratio of 1 to 5 to 5, starter to flour to water. And in that way, it never gets a chance to get acidic. So we're going to discard all but 20 grams of our starter and feed it 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. And you can use this discard to bake with, but remember that you do need to replenish some of this starter and place it back into the refrigerator. My favorite way to do this is to actually wait until this starter that I'm feeding right now reaches its peak and then taking at least 10 grams of that starter out, replenishing it and placing it back into the refrigerator. So that way, my starter's always at its peak activity and it just gets a little bit more of a feed and it stays a little bit healthier by feeding it more often. Then it goes back into the refrigerator after it's been replenished and has a little rest on the counter, and it'll be ready for you when it peaks again. We will just keep an eye on our starter and try and create our leaven when our starter is at its peak activity. However, you don't have to worry about trying to find the exact peak activity or whether or not it's going to peak during the night or while you're at work or something like that. Because if it has already peaked and fallen, all you have to do is give it a small snack and it will be back to its peak within the hour. We will just keep an eye on our starter and try and create our leaven when our starter is at its peak activity. So I like to feed my starter to reactivate it at around dinner time the day before I'd like to bake. I find it takes 12 to 15 hours for my starter to peak when I feed it in a ratio of 1 to 5 to 5, and it is at 20 degrees Celsius room temperature, which is about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is where you're going to need to experiment a little and try feeding your starter the 1 to 5 to 5 ratio at dinner time and see when it peaks the next day. And if you're finding it doesn't peak when you want to, when works with your schedule, then just change it up a bit. So now that we've fed our starter to reactivate it, leave it in a nice snuggly spot until tomorrow and have a look at it in the morning. I like to think of it as reactivating our starter as it's been sleeping away in the refrigerator. Now we're going to reactivate it, give it a kickstart, and make it nice and active and bubbly just in time to mix our leaven tomorrow. And if you'd like to mix a loaf with me, just click on the link below to make my Just Like the Real Thing sourdough loaf together. Hope you have a good evening, and I'll see you there.